Hi, I'm here to talk about performative utterances. That sounds complicated. It is kind of complicated. I hope you'll understand it after this video is over. Here's an example.
I declare bankruptcy!
So, the manager of this fictional office, Michael Scott, there just declared bankruptcy. Um, did he though? It seems wrong to say he declared bankruptcy, although he came out and said he declared something. He came out and said, I declare bankruptcy. Um, Now, that won't have the effect that he probably intended. He probably meant for that to, dissolve his debt or at least make him not legally obligated to pay back his debts for some time. Um, but it won't have that effect because he didn't say it under the right circumstances. And usually, when you declare bankruptcy, you do it in writing, you don't do it verbally, right? So, this is actually a failed example of what we're talking about today. Um, but here's some more examples. This is a good example. I now pronounce you husband and wife. So this clip art wedding here features a priest, and the priest presumably was hired just to do this, right? I now pronounce you husband and wife. And by pronouncing them husband and wife, he's had the effect of marrying them, right? So those two are now married just as soon as he finishes saying this. Or I guess even as soon as he finishes saying the word pronounce. Now, he has to be specific about what he's pronouncing them, right? So, this is a good example, right? This is what a performative is, right? He performed a verb, and the performance of that verb had the effect of accomplishing that verb, right? When he said, I pronounce, he pronounced. On the other hand, if the little girl, maybe the bride's niece or something, says, I now pronounce you husband and wife, it doesn't have the same effect, right? She, by saying, I now pronounce you husband and wife, did not actually pronounce anything, right? Um, Keeping in mind, pronounce can mean two different things, right? So, of course, she pronounced, as in she used her lips and mouth to make sounds, but she didn't pronounce them husband and wife, even though she said it just the same way that the priest did, right? The bride also can't pronounce herself a wife. That would be very strange. Um, so we see that for this verb pronounce to have the effect of actually turning someone from, a person, a man into a husband and a woman into a wife, it has to be said by a certain person. And if we look at the situation even more closely, we'll see that it has to be said under certain circumstances too. Um, for example, the priest has to have some kind of legal license to do this, right? He can't just put on a robe and start pronouncing people husband and wife. So, the idea that certain verbs are accomplished by just saying them is the idea behind performativity. So, performative utterances perform themselves by their utterance. That's a little confusing, but for example, when you say I hereby announce, you have announced, you have accomplished the action that verb describes by just saying it, right? I hereby decline, declines, right? If you say I hereby resign, you have resigned, right? If you say I hereby tweet, on the other hand, you have not tweeted. This does not work with every verb. It only works with some verbs, and which verbs it works with depends on the language and the culture that you're in. Okay? So, that's performativity. When you use the verb in a sentence under certain conditions, you accomplish the verb, right? Okay. So, a performative becomes true through its performance, and it resembles a declarative in that sense. It becomes true after it's said, but unlike a declarative, performatives do not describe a reality that exists outside of the speaker, right, or outside of the action performed by the utterance. So a declarative sentence, a sentence that describes something in the real world, can sometimes resemble a performative sentence, but they're different. So a declarative sentence could be like, he has a dog, right? Or it is sunny. It is sunny today. right? Um, and that's might look through like a performative. Like I say, if I say I pronounce some words differently, and I say I pronounce you husband and wife, those sentences had very similar grammar. One of them was a performative and one of them was not, right? So performatives are unlike declaratives, although they might resemble each other, right? So I now pronounce you husband and wife, that could be a performative. I sometimes pronounce you husband and wife, that's not a performative. And it's very difficult sometimes to tease apart what separates a performative from something else, but we know it when we see it because we know that after someone says, I now pronounce you husband and wife, someone is married. Whereas after someone says, I sometimes pronounce you husband and wife, nothing happened other than the person saying that. Okay? Because a performative doesn't describe an external reality, we don't use the terms true or false conventionally to talk about them, although they can fail for a variety of reasons. We don't call them false, we call them infelicitous, which is kind of a technical word. Makes you sound smart, which is a good thing for technical words. And the reasons that they fail are called infelicities, right? And there can be a lot of these. We sort of hinted at some of them earlier, but I'm going to go over some of them. Some of the reasons that a performative could fail to have the effect of making its main verb true, right? So the first and maybe the most obvious is that the performative ritual must exist in that language. By the way, I don't have a slide for this, but this terminology almost all comes from a linguist named J.L. Austin. And I think he was the first one to describe performatives in English. But of course, performatives existed a long time before he named them. But anyway, so the ritual must exist in that language, and it must. Let's see, performatives are very picky about which verbs they use. So there are certain verbs that are performative under certain conditions and some that just aren't, even if they mean almost the same thing. So one of them is, one of the verbs that's not is insult. And insult, the verb insult describes verbal behavior. Like if I say, you dork, then I have insulted you, right? But you cannot perform the act of insulting by using the verb insult in a sentence. So if you say, I insult you, I hereby insult you so bad, I still haven't insulted you, right? I haven't performed the act of insulting yet, right? But other verbs that mean almost the same thing, like rebuke, can be performative. So I rebuke you. If I say I rebuke you, then I have rebuked you, right? And I don't need to say anything else. I don't need to say, I rebuke you, you dork. Because rebuke does all the work for me, right? So, again, the condition is the verb has to be a performative in that language. So, different languages have different performatives. There are some performatives I know in Japanese that, like, moshiagemasu, which basically means I say, but it's very formal sounding. And I don't know of a performative that has the same effect in English. Anyway, so there are a lot of other conditions, and the other conditions will really depend on the particular verb and the culture and society in which they're said. So, as we saw with the example of the priest, the speaker has to be the right kind of person, has to be recognized as a person who has that kind of authority in order to perform a performative speech act, right? So a priest or someone who's ordained or a judge or certain other officially recognized positions can say, I pronounce you husband and wife, and that will have the effect of marrying two people. A person who does not have those titles, like me, I'm going to do it right now, okay? You watching the video, I pronounce you husband or wife or something like that. And that didn't do anything, right? I didn't actually accomplish anything by saying that because I don't have that authority. Okay. Some other conditions, and when these aren't met, again, they're called infelicities. In some cases, you have to have the consent of the other people present. So you can't, so here's a rogue priest. He's just accosting people on their first dates and saying, I now pronounce you husband and wife. And then he leaves. That does not have the effect of marrying two people because he didn't have the consent of the two people involved. I don't know, maybe they're on their first date. They look like, I don't know, I imagine they're high schoolers from the 50s or something. The ribbon on her head makes her look younger, you know. Um, but anyway, you can't perform the act of marrying people without the consent of the two people involved, right? And that's just a condition that applies specifically to that verb, in this case, pronounce. Another condition that's pretty common across performatives is you have to say, actually, this is probably true for all of them, you have to say them out loud. Okay, so a declarative can be true or false, even if not said out loud. Like I can just think, the sky is blue, right? I thought the sky is blue, and that was true or false independent of whether I said it. Performatives don't become true unless they're said out loud, right? So a priest can't just walk by and think, I hereby pronounce you husband and wife, right? And have that effect. Even if it is a wedding, even if it's the timing that the priest should say that, they actually have to say it. They can't just think it, right? Um, and there are numerous other conditions that have to be met um, that depend on the situation and the verb being used for them to have their effect. So just taking the verb bet as an example. So bet can be a performative in certain conditions. Like I bet $5 on the Lakers to win the NBA championship. Said in front of my bookie. I don't really have a bookie, okay? But it said in front of my bookie with the money in hand, it has the effect of placing the bet. Um, Now, if I don't have the money, then that's infelicitous for that particular utterance, for that particular performative. If the person I'm talking to is not my bookie, that also is infelicitous, right? If I'm talking to myself, that's infelicitous. They all depend on the particular verb that's trying to be performed, and it really depends on the particular verb. So I can't really say anything that's true for all performatives, but there are a number of ways in which performatives can be made infelicitous and therefore not have their effect. Okay, there are some other conditions that are grammar related that are sometimes hard conditions that you can't have a performative unless it has this particular grammar, and then sometimes they're more like tendencies that people tend to make performatives with these grammatical characteristics. So performatives are almost always a first person singular because you can't perform an action on behalf of someone else. Like the same way that you can't, eat ice cream on behalf of someone else, right? So Justin Bieber, he can announce his candidacy for the office of President of the United States in 2024, and this would be infelicitous for other reasons, but the grammar makes sense. Infelicitous because he's not a citizen of the U.S., or he wasn't born in the U.S. anyway. You can't generally make a performative utterance with a third person subject, right? So he or she or Biebs announces his candidacy for the office of President of the United States in 2024. And I suppose this is a soft condition rather than a hard condition. You can imagine circumstances where a performative could have effect with a third person subject. For example, if I were the person's lawyer and the person had granted me authority to negotiate on his or her behalf, then this could work. Or if the person just happens to be idiosyncratically referring to him or herself in the third person, then it could still have effect, but generally not. And for the same reason, a third person subject who's not in those conditions, where it's not a lawyer and you're not talking about yourself, basically does not perform any action. So when Justin says the believers announce their candidacy, he hasn't actually announced anything, right? He hasn't made himself a candidate, or he hasn't made them a candidate. They have to do that themselves, preferably on a one-by-one basis. So a fan club cannot be a president. So let's see. Performatives are almost always present simple, and they resemble what we call the narrative present, like he shoots, he scores, except it's first person, so I shoot, I score. Or what we call the literary present, where when we're talking about the events in a book, we almost always use the present tense, like when Bilbo reaches Mount Doom, he refuses to give up the ring, even though this all happened a long time ago. Even though we watched the movie 5 years ago, we still use the present tense to narrate like that. Performatives look like that. So a judge sentencing someone to prison probably will use the simple present and say, I sentence you, not I will sentence you, or something like that. So it might look like this: I sentence you to 10 years in prison. Probably not, I am sentencing you to 10 years in prison. That sounds like he's describing what he's doing rather than actually doing the sentencing. And then the past tense is never performative because I just sentence you describes an action that by definition occurred before, not an action that's occurring right now. So yeah, performatives are almost always present simple. So I declare, I sentence, I announce, etc. Okay, and you can test whether an utterance is performative or not by trying to add the adverb hereby. Now, this isn't to say that all performatives use the adverb hereby, but they all can. Okay, so if you use the verb hereby and it sounds all right, it's performative. Okay, so the priest could say, I hereby pronounce you husband and wife. The adverb hereby usually comes right before the verb there. I hereby taste the wedding cake doesn't work because hereby has to come with a performative and taste is not a performative. That is to say, you don't taste the wedding cake by saying, I taste the wedding cake. The same way that you pronounce someone husband and wife by saying, I pronounce you husband and wife. Hereby reserve one king room for the night of the 24th. Yeah, you can't actually reserve a room this way. The reservation has to be done by the clerk, not by the person, not by the guest, right? Yeah, that one was funny for me because you do use the verb reserve to describe your action of calling the clerk to make a reservation, but you can't reserve it by saying, I hereby reserve. It's bizarre, isn't it? Okay, so that was it for performatives, but let's see, why should you care about this? It's part of a larger movement in the philosophy of language to see speech not just as a vehicle for words and grammar and a way of carrying declarative utterances that are either true or false to other people's brains. Speaking in itself is an action that shows things about the reality that we live in, shows things about our society, shows things about our internal lives, and can have effects on other people, right? So speech acts can sometimes interfere with people's lives the same way that a physical act can interfere with someone's lives or, improves people's lives, etc. Specifically, performatives do this by altering the social reality that people live in, right? So a performative utterance like I pronounce you husband and wife changes the social reality for all the people involved and all the people who interact with that couple in the future. So the performative in this case, simply speaking a sentence, created a new reality, right? Changed the reality that we as humans all share. And it's part of this bigger philosophical idea of the social construction of reality that I'm not really going to broach today. But, you guys are undergrads. You'll definitely hear that again in your years in university. Okay? So thanks for listening. I hereby release you from this video.